Introduction. The forest of Moonless Valley has always been an object of rumor and fear. Its gloomy thickets, frozen out of time, seem to be the haunt of old legends. Some said it was the abode of an ancient spirit that devoured souls, others that it was a mere obsession. Mikhail had never believed these tales until one day, years after his childhood, he was drawn there. It wasn't a spontaneous decision. It was a long, agonizing call, germinating in his consciousness. Something inside whispered, "You have to find out the truth or this feeling won't let go." Katerina, his longtime girlfriend, took to the idea with enthusiasm. "Let's check it out," she suggested, with a smirk. "You're not the type to be afraid of fairy tales, are you?" But if Michael had known what awaited them, he would never have set foot outside the threshold of the valley. The backstory. Mikhail's grandfather was a man of few words, but every story he told, spoken in a husky voice, tugged at the heartstrings. As a child, he told of terrifying walks in Moonless Valley. But one day he stopped abruptly and warned, "Those trees see you. No matter what you do, they always know who you really are." Mikhail only shrugged his shoulders at the time, but the years passed, and the images from his grandfather's stories took root in his mind. Why did he come back? Why was he silent? And what had he seen there, in that forest? The answers did not give rest, and when one day Mikhail found himself at the threshold of that very valley, everything inside told him, "You will learn the truth." Part 1. Ordinary World. Mikhail lived an ordinary life: work, rare meetings with friends, endless attempts to fill the void. Life in the city was monotonous, devoid of spark. The only thing that kept him going were short conversations with Katerina. She was the only person who understood his longing for something more. "Mish," she said one day, sipping coffee. "You want to get out of all this? You know, feel alive?" Those words seared into his soul. That's when he remembered Moonless Valley. Part 2. A Call to Adventure. Katerina accepted his offer almost immediately. "Are you serious?" She laughed, but her eyes glittered. "I thought you were joking. What if there really is something there?" Mikhail only shrugged, "Then we'll be the first to know the truth." And so, a week later, they stood at the edge of the forest. The air was strangely heavy, as if imbued with something old, unseen. "This seems like a bad idea," Katerina muttered, but took a step forward nonetheless. Part 3. Refusing to be summoned. They walked for almost an hour until they began to feel a strange pressure. "Shit," Katerina stopped, her voice shaking. "Why does it feel like we've gone too far?" Mikhail looked at her silently. "Should we really go back?" But something inside, some quiet whisper, kept her from backing away. Suddenly, a sound came from behind the trees, something between a whisper and a roar. "Did you hear that?" Katerina grasped his arm. Mikhail nodded. They were no longer alone. Part 4. Meeting my mentor. The noise grew louder, as if the trees themselves were whispering something to each other. Katerina recoiled. "Misha, this isn't normal. The forest shouldn't sound like that." Mikhail tried to reassure her, "Maybe it's just the wind." But inside everything was screaming that there could be no wind here. And then, right in front of them, a figure emerged from the fog. An old man in dark, faded clothes. He was thin, with angular features and strangely glowing eyes. "You've gone farther than you should have." His voice was quiet, but somehow penetrating. "Who are you?" Katerina blurted out, stepping back. "The question is not who I am. The question is why you came here." The old man bowed his head as if scrutinizing them. "Everyone who enters this forest carries their truth. And you are no exception." Mikhail felt everything turn upside down inside. "What are you talking about?" The old man grinned. "You will soon find out. But remember, the forest only accepts those who are willing to accept themselves." And before they could say anything, he disappeared, as if vanishing into the mist. Part 5. Crossing the first rapids. After the meeting with the old man, the forest seemed different. The silence was deeper, the darkness thicker. Trees shrank around them as if animated, and the air was filled with the heavy, damp odor of decay. "We have to go back," Katerina squeezed Mikhail's hand. He looked up at her. "You can leave, but I can't. If I leave now, I'll never be able to sleep properly again." His voice sounded firm, but inside he was seething with fear. They continued walking until they came to a small clearing. Scattered things lay on the ground, faded backpacks, torn clothes, old maps. "Is this a camp?" Katerina looked around in horror. But Mikhail noticed something odd. All the things looked as if they had been lying there for decades, but there were no signs of decay or the ravages of time. Part 6. Trials, Allies, Enemies. When they decided to move on, the forest seemed to come alive. Every rustle made them flinch. "Do you hear that?" Katerina turned around. In the distance, someone or something was rustling leaves. Could it be an animal? Mikhail tried to speak confidently, but his voice gave him away. Suddenly there was a scraping sound, as if claws had been swiped across the wood. They turned around, but saw nothing. Katerina screamed, "I can't take it anymore, Misha. This place wants to kill us." He tried to calm her down, but he himself could already feel something dark and cold slowly creeping into their minds. "We have to stick together," he said, but immediately realized she wasn't there. Katerina was gone. Part 7. Approaching the cave. Mikhail was thrashing between the trees, shouting her name. "Katya! Where are you?" The forest seemed to savor his fear. Every step he took echoed with strange, alien sounds. And then he heard her voice. Weak, hoarse, full of fear, "Misha, help." He rushed toward the sound, but he didn't find her. Instead, he came upon a huge tree trunk covered with strange red marks, as if it had a life of its own. For a moment he thought the tree was looking right at him. "You won't find her until you find yourself," came a whisper from nowhere. "What does that mean?" Mikhail shouted into the void. But there was no answer. Part 8. The Greatest Test. Katerina's voice sounded fainter and fainter, as if dissolving into the whisper of the forest. Mikhail did not stop calling for her, but he felt that time was running out. At every step the forest seemed to push him, creating more and more obstacles, tree roots that stretched like snakes, and thick fog that made it impossible to see the road. "Enough!" he shouted in frustration, slamming his fist into the nearest trunk. "I know what you're doing, forest. But I'm not giving up. I'll find her." With those words, he felt a strange calm inside him, as if the fear that had tormented him all this time had suddenly receded. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and just listened. Silence. No, not silence exactly. A barely perceptible sound, like breathing or faint whisper, came from somewhere to his left. Mikhail took a step in that direction, and it was as if the world had changed. The fog cleared and he saw Katerina sitting on the ground under a huge tree. Her face was pale, but her eyes, they burned with a strange luster. "Katya! Thank God I found you." Mikhail fell on his knees before her. She raised her head and whispered, "Why have you come, Misha? You don't understand. This place, it changes us." Part 9. Reward. Mikhail lifted her to her feet, but she shivered. "Katya, we're going to get out of here. Together. Hold on to me, do you hear me?" There was a desperate determination in his voice. She remained silent, but her hand still encircled his wrist. They walked slowly, stumbling over roots and breaking through branches that seemed to get in their way on purpose. The forest did not want to let them go. But with each step Mikhail felt something inside him change. There was no longer the panic that had overwhelmed him at the beginning. Every step was a struggle, but now he knew that he was stronger. And then, after what seemed like an eternity of hours of wandering, they saw light. Real daylight, shining through the trees. Part 10. The way back. They came to the edge of the forest, and Mikhail felt the air around them becoming lighter and the noise of the forest becoming quieter. Katerina turned to him. "You saved us, Misha. But what if this forest will always be with us now? What if we'll never be the same again?" Her words echoed in his soul. For he felt it too. The forest had left its imprint. Part 11. Resurrection. Mikhail looked at Katerina for a long time, trying to find words. Finally he said, "We may not be the same. But perhaps it's for the best. This forest has shown us who we really are. And you know what? I'm ready to accept that." His voice sounded firm, but inside he was still struggling with doubts. Katerina nodded. "You're right. But I still can't get over his whispers. They sounded like they knew everything about me." Part 12. Returning with the elixir. They returned to the city, but they both knew that their old life was somewhere behind them. Mikhail felt that he had become stronger, but now he saw the world differently. Every day he understood more and more the old man's words. The forest accepts only those who are ready to accept themselves. That phrase haunted him, making him replay the events in his head over and over again. But he realized the main thing: sometimes you have to get lost to find yourself. Epilogue. A few years later, Mikhail met an old man from the forest by chance. He was sitting on a bench in the city park, just as calm and mysterious. "You knew this would happen," Mikhail began. The old man looked at him and smiled slightly. The forest only gives answers to those who are ready to hear them. Mikhail wanted to ask more, but the old man got up and walked away, leaving only the faint smell of pine needles behind him. Mikhail stood looking after him and thought, was he really there?